identity. Until then, it had been mostly an unorganized, unconnected band of white supremacist pockets in the South comprised of different dens of Confederate sympathizers. Now, they had a leader and a face. The first iteration of the Klan was like the extreme version of white boys gone wild, essentially ransacking unsuspecting colored victims with violent, reckless abandon without consequence. This era of violence followed the assassination of Lincoln in 1865 and was in the wake of the 1868 presidential election between Democrat Horatio Seymour and Republican Ulysses S. Grant. During the election, squads of dirty white boys harassed, terrorized, kidnapped, beat, tortured, and even murdered Americans at the polls. Forrest would also campaign himself during the election. On the recruiting trail looking to grow whitehood membership, he traveled all over the South in preparation for their lynch mob shenanigans, holding hang a nigga pep rallies in front of calcified crowds of thousands. By the election in 1868, there were over 1,000 incidents, including the attack of Americans at the polls by the KKK and other splinter cells of white supremacy.
Come on, young. You see, back in these times, it was actually imperative to be able to cast your vote. Voting, having a say in your local government and the policies that are implemented, I mean, it was everything. It was such a new invention to these Europeans. I mean, they stole it from us, the whole democratic process. Look it up if you don't believe me. They come from Europe, right? Kings and queens and monarchs. They don't know a goddamn thing about democracy. They stole that from the Iroquois Confederacy and the Creek Confederacy. We taught them savages how to be democratic, checks and balances, different branches of government. But it's very, very interesting that most people don't know that the KKK wasn't just about terrorizing black folks and scaring them and lynching them, but they had specific missions in mind. And the first one was to prevent us from voting. Now, we know nowadays in 2025, voting does not have the same weight that it used to. We all know it's rigged, two wings of the same bird, but back in those times, voting meant the world. And the KKK was predicated off of keeping us from having a say in what goes on around us in our own ancestral homeland. I mean, God damn it, think about it, y'all. Think about it. Couldn't even vote. Why don't we get any Purge movies about black folks trying to go vote for the first time and the KKK shows up purging motherfuckers? We can't get no Purge movies like that, but we get those terrible D-rated Purge movies that they've been making as of late, right? I'm just saying, there's so many untold stories. So many untold stories.
There was an inherent, yet fundamental hatred among Confederate whites and their feelings toward Negroes that went far beyond just racism. Most of the socially prominent men in the South were former Confederate soldiers who had just lost the war and the right to hold public office. But most of the voting socially active Negroes were veterans of the victorious Union Army. It was already bad enough they lost the war, but losing the election to a nappy-headed tar baby made them Confederate crackers downright saltine. In the areas where colored participation was more active, so were the Pink Pillagers. In 1866, in Memphis and New Orleans, two cities with significantly higher populations of freedmen, after the war, there were scenes of massacre and riots. In both cases, the police departments in Memphis and New Orleans were involved in the perpetuation of terrorism against its colored citizens.
This is your history.
In Memphis, Negroes were destructively pushed out of the city, resulting in a significant reduction of the Memphis Negro population.
I'd say it's our history.
Men were tortured, beaten, and killed. Women were raped. Homes, schools, and churches were burned. But there was also another underlying factor to this bad blood. The hate Irish immigrants had for the newly enfranchised Americans. The Irish were just getting their foot in the American door, as most Irish non-indigent servants were first or second generation. And now their jobs are getting taken away by the newly ascended Negroes.
Oh my God.
The Memphis Police Department was notoriously corrupt and routinely threatened and harassed colored Union soldiers. Nearly all police officers in Memphis at the time were Irish immigrants. These Mickey Fickies got their willies wet tormenting Negroes. So they took special exception to seeing Negroes in uniform wielding firearms, who would at times intervene when the police would senselessly beat citizens in the streets. The consequence of this tension between Irish police officers and black Union soldiers led to the 1866 massacre. Other areas were also affected by other forms of mob violence. Resentful rebels ran roughshod and created the conditions of chaos, danger, and uncertainty that people hadn't experienced since before the war. The people who are being threatened now have arms. This always instilled within whites fear of black retribution. If the frontier west of the Mississippi was called the Wild West, then this was the savage South. And if the whites weren't afraid of Negro insurrection, they were under the constant threat of the wild black rapist and his big black snake that'll make even the purest white woman moan.
Get your ass back in my house.
And them good old boys would stop at nothing to keep those mangy moon cricket claws off Bessie's milky white skin. And if that meant they had to fabricate rape narratives, so be it. Them boys were running wild. So wild that after Grant won the presidency, he sent the military down south to corral the Klan and their cronies. This act is monumental for being possibly the first time the American government intervened against whites for the protection of so-called blacks. After the military was sent by Grant, the Klan was thwarted, but was not completely destroyed. The members were still out there pulling stunts, but their power had been greatly diminished. This marks the end of the first KKK era. However, the Klan would rise again. Who were these so-called black people being terrorized by the Klan? The conventional belief was that all these black people who had formerly been enslaved were Africans. But was that true? For context, we are referring to the so-called colored people from Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana. The most pressing question would be, if all of these so-called black people were transported from Africa, by what means did they reach the Deep South? Is there any evidence in the transatlantic slave trade database that the number of people representative of the black population in the Deep South went through any of the ports in that area? The largest slave trading port in this area was New Orleans.
Come on, y'all. We talked about the secret war that the KKK waged against Native Black Americans, but now let's get into this whole misnomer that we all descend from West African slaves. I mean, where are the slave boats? Where are the manifests? Where are the insurance documents? Guess what? I've read them. I've seen them. Slaves did come from Africa to North America, but guess what? It was barely any at all. Less than 4% of the African slaves trafficked during the transatlantic slave trade, less than 4% came to North America. The research that I've done has indicated between 50,000 to 90,000 African slaves came to North America, what would later be known as the United States. Guys, we've got over 42 million Black Americans present day. You can't get 42 million Black Americans from a sample population size of 50 to 90,000 African slaves. That's logistically impossible. But let's get on into it, shall we?
And there are a few others. But to put these statistics in context, according to the database, less than 10,000 Africans disembarked at the port of New Orleans throughout the entirety of the slave trade, from as early as 1719 to 1860. But the Black population in the South was in the millions. Are we really supposed to believe that the millions of Negroes in the Deep South were descended from just a couple of thousand Africans recorded in the database? As mentioned previously, the largest slave ports were on the east coast of the United States. Places like Maryland, Virginia, and New York had the highest number of slaves entering and exiting through their ports. And cities like Charleston and Savannah were the closest major ports in the Deep South. And yet that location is nowhere close to the millions of so-called Negroes along the Mississippi. And to assume that a shipment of Africans could arrive at Charleston and then trek over 1,000 miles across the country, over the Appalachian Mountains, and to the river by slave traders is an asinine, Assa 10, Assa 11 assumption. These people who were enslaved had always lived on the land, but were eventually pushed out, first by the French, prior to the French-Indian War, and then later the British, and then the Americans after the Revolution. The majority of these people enslaved in the Deep South were descendants of the tribes along the Mississippi, like the Natchez, the Chitimacha, the Choctaw, the Creek, and Chickasaw, just to name a few. Any scholastic citation that accounts these people along the Mississippi River as African is patently false and cannot be substantiated by any historical documentation or even in the transatlantic slave trade data.
How Afro get in front of my mother race. I ain't never been to Afro color. I never been to Africa. Afro or Africa. Never been there. I'm not from Africa. I'm born and raised in Goose, Florida. I'm born in Goose, raised in Liberty City, in the Poker Bean Project. I ain't never went to Africa. Ain't thinking about going there. And I heard it's a beautiful place. Yes. I know it's the motherland, yes. But not my mother, not her mother, and not her mother's mother. That ain't their land. American real true land is right here, the U.S. soil.